Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, it's good to be together. I was just telling someone after I don't know how many weeks of doing this and having near perfect weather except for some wind, we can deal with a little bit of mist. If it ever gets too much and it's unwise for us to be out here worshiping, we'll just call it a morning and go home, and you can finish worship at home, gather together on the Zoom call at 11 o'clock. The story that we're going to read today is 7 chapters in Genesis. It's a fantastic story, the story of Joseph. I even see a rainbow umbrella. That I don't know if that's like a hint at the rainbow coat of many colors that Joseph has or not. But Joy brought it. She's very proud of herself. But we have gone from God creating a good world, seeing that everything is very good, good people, good creation, to the broken relationships that happen. We saw through the Adam and Eve story. Then we saw the call and the promise of Abraham and Sarah and what their family would be as God's people and as a blessing for the whole world. And we have this wonderfully tragic family drama through Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and then Jacob and Esau. So these are the stories that unfortunately we are passing over, but they're wonderful, wonderful stories. So please continue to look those up and read through those. The story from Joseph. Joseph now is the great-grandson of Abraham and Sarah. So he is one of the sons of Jacob, whose name became Israel. Okay? So Joseph is one of those sons. Joseph has, he's one of the younger ones. He has some dreams. He sees himself. He interprets these dreams as being that he is going to rule over his brothers. And his brothers, working hard in the field, are kind of sick and tired of hearing about this because he keeps having these dreams about he's going to be in charge and he's going to rule over them. So they make this plot to get rid of him. So when they're out in the field one day, they strip him of his coat, they put him in a hole, they kill an animal and put its blood all over his coat. They come back and they tell their dad, Joseph died. He got attacked by a wild animal. His dad is depressed. He's mortified that his son could die in this way. The brothers go back and they end up selling Joseph to some slave traders that are on their way to Egypt. So Joseph ends up being in Egypt as a slave after this whole terrible family drama. So it's at that point that I'm going to read from the second part of the story according to the Shine On Bible. But again, please find time to read through this whole story. It's amazing. So the second half goes like this. God was with Joseph while he was a slave in Egypt, even when he was wrongly sent to jail. There Joseph explained the meaning of dreams to 2 of Pharaoh's workers. When Pharaoh himself had troubling dreams, one of the workers remembered Joseph. Pharaoh sent for Joseph and asked, "What do my dreams mean?" In his first dream, Pharaoh was standing by the Nile River. 7 fat cows came out of the river, then 7 thin cows ate the fat cows. Next, he dreamed about 7 fat ears of grain that were swallowed by skinny ears of grain. I'm sure people around here have nightmares about skinny ears of grain. Joseph explained, there will be 7 good years and then 7 years of famine. Choose someone wise to be in charge of Egypt. Gather food and store it for the years of famine. You are very wise, said Pharaoh. Pharaoh placed his ring on Joseph's finger and put him in command. Meanwhile, a famine came to Canaan, where Joseph's family lived. Father Jacob said, "Go to Egypt to buy grain." All of his sons except young Benjamin left for Egypt. When they got there, they bowed down to Joseph without knowing he was their brother. Remember his dreams? Joseph accused them of being spies and put them in jail. Then he released all but one of them on the condition that they would bring their younger brother to him. When the brothers got back to Canaan, they told Jacob that they had to take Benjamin back with them. "No," cried Jacob, "I won't lose Benjamin." But the famine got worse. So Jacob told his sons, "Go to Egypt. May God be merciful. Take some food and money as a present to this man in Egypt." Joseph organized a feast. The brothers bowed down and gave him gifts, but still did not recognize him. Finally, Joseph said, "Come closer to me. I am your brother Joseph. God has used me to keep many people alive. Bring our father and your families to live in Egypt." Joseph hugged his brothers. The brothers returned to their father to tell him the news, "Your son is alive." Jacob's family left Canaan and settled in Egypt. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
I will be reading a reflection on this story of Joseph from Keith Albrecht. He writes, "I like to read. I usually read from 40 to 50 books every year, mostly novels. Few of the novels I have read have the drama and intrigue in them as the story of Joseph contains. His story starts with parental favoritism, which leads to jealousy by his brothers, which leads to conspiracy to murder Joseph. First, one has to ask how a parent can show favoritism to one child and not expect hard feelings among the other siblings. Okay, a parent may have a favorite son or daughter, but they treat them all the same. This was not the case for Joseph. He was treated so much better than his brothers, and they hated him for it. Only because of the brothers, one of the brothers seemed to have a little more sense than the others. His life was spared. But he was sold to some traders on their way to Egypt, where he was sold again to one of Pharaoh's officers. God was with Joseph, and everything he did for his master prospered with it. So Joseph was put in charge of everything in the officer's house. This is where Joseph's good fortune went bad. The officer's wife saw how handsome Joseph was, and tried to get him to sleep with her. Joseph knew that it was wrong and refused to do it. The woman was after Joseph every day to sleep with her, but he refused. One time she grabbed Joseph by his garment. Joseph pulled away from her and ran out of the house, leaving his garment with the woman. She had all the evidence she needed to make it very bad for Joseph, and that is exactly what she did. She told her husband that Joseph forced her to sleep with him. Joseph was promptly thrown into prison. Again, God was with Joseph when he was in prison. The jailer put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners. This included interpreting dreams. The dreams always came out the way Joseph interpreted them. Then when Pharaoh had a couple of dreams and no one was able to interpret them, Joseph was called to interpret the dreams. First, Joseph gave God the credit for his ability to interpret them. He told Pharaoh his dreams meant that there were these 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine throughout the country. When Pharaoh saw that God was with Joseph, he put Joseph in charge of storing up food and grain for the 7 years of famine. Joseph stored up grain every place he could. When the 7 years of famine started, Joseph was in charge of distributing the grain where it was needed. Even back in Joseph's home country, there was famine. Jacob sent his older sons to Egypt to buy some grain. Joseph immediately recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. One would think that after what Joseph had been through, since he had been sold to the traders by his brothers, he would be happy to see his brothers again. But no, he had to try to get just a little revenge, and accuse his brothers of spying the first time they came and of stealing the second time they came for grain. Joseph was a man of God. In every situation that Joseph found himself in, from the pit his brothers threw him into, to his rise of power to be Pharaoh's #1 man, God was with Joseph. We have to ask then, why did Joseph try to get a little revenge on his brothers when they came to Egypt to buy grain? Why couldn't he welcome them immediately and forget about the past? Maybe it was not revenge Joseph was seeking. Maybe he was testing his brothers to see if they had given up their sinful ways. Well, like Derek already said, last week we began the story of this wild ride through the Old Testament this fall. And so we began the story of a family. Remember the family of Abraham and Sarah. Although we didn't know much about Abraham and Sarah when God called them, we reflected on the difficulties they encountered on their journey through the years of waiting. Finally, Isaac was born, right? This child of promise, that through the offspring of Abraham, the whole world would be blessed. This family story then continued to the next generation with Isaac marrying Rebekah, and they have these 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. And it is a complex story, family story of tensions between parents and children, a mixed-up blessing, and a time of family separation. It is this family story filled with conflict that reaches down into this next generation, into our story today of Joseph, Jacob's favorite son. Joseph's story, almost from the beginning, is about a family disintegrating due to the favoritism of the father, jealousy of the brothers, and the deceit that brings brokenness and alienation and separation. Likely many of us remember from our early Sunday school days, right, about the young Joseph who was favored with this beautiful many-color coat, a royal coat in some ways. And so the older brothers are jealous, and even more so when Joseph tells them his dreams, right, of them bowing down to him. And so the brothers, angry and upset, seize their chance one day and they get rid of Joseph. They throw him into the pit, eventually selling them as a slave to Egyptian traders, and return to their father with his blood-stained coat. In Egypt, Joseph becomes a servant in Potiphar's household and rises to responsible position. The drama turns with Potiphar's wife's untrue accusation, and Joseph is sent to prison. And in prison, Joseph rises again to a place of overseeing the day-to-day operations. He encounters the royal cupbearer and baker, and Joseph interprets their dreams, which come to reality while Joseph remains in prison. And when Pharaoh has a dream, he is able to obtain when he couldn't obtain satisfactory interpretation. The cupbearer finally remembers Joseph and brings him out, and so Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream. And Pharaoh is impressed and places Joseph in command, where he once again wears a royal coat. For most of the Joseph story, as we read, if you go back and read the text, God is surprisingly confined to the background. Unlike in the familiar stories, family stories of God does not speak to Joseph like he did with Abraham, nor did God give direct commands like he did with Isaac, nor does God engage in direct struggle like he did with Jacob, if you remember those stories. With Joseph, God stays hidden, not speaking or intervening in dramatic ways, controlling people or events. The narrator simply tells us that God was present with Joseph. God was Joseph's companion in the events of his life, in the house of Potiphar, in prison, and in his rise to power. Joseph's success in his leadership role as he grew in wisdom and patience depended upon this hidden presence of God. So this brings us towards the end of the story, the part of this family story where Joseph, once sold into captivity by his brothers, encounters them again. The famine has reached the land of Canaan, so Jacob has sent his sons to Egypt to buy food. Joseph's true identity is obscured, and his brothers interact with him in ignorance. Joseph intentionally treats them as strangers, accuses of them of being spies, sets up a test, trying to find out, what is the current status of my long-lost family? During these interactions, Joseph sees that his brothers have changed, for he observes they are capable of mutual care for each other and self-sacrifice. The brothers return home and are forced by the severity of the famine to return the second time to get food, and their father Jacob has agreed to let Benjamin, the youngest son, go with them as Joseph requested. And when they return, Joseph's secret of who he is becomes unbearable, and he finally reveals himself to them. Full of emotion, he says, I am Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And the brothers are speechless. To say they are dismayed by this revelation is an understatement. Fear and shame are theirs. Joseph has the power to do them harm or even seek retribution. Banishment, imprisonment, enslavement, and even execution are within his authority. However, Joseph's response is gracious. For he is able to see that the events of his life have had a purpose. And so he tells his brothers, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, for God sent me before you to preserve life. God sent me to preserve for you a remnant on earth and keep alive for many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. Now we have no hint in the text that Joseph understood this before this particular moment. It is only at this moment of revelation to his brothers that Joseph realizes that he was part of God's plan and is able to articulate the divine sovereignty in his life. God sent Joseph, and his life has meaning. Joseph believes his life is the means of grace by which God would save God's people. Through the brothers' betrayal, Joseph has grown powerful in worldly authority, and because of his position, will now be able to save a remnant. Joseph, at this point, is able to give meaning to all the events in his life. He affirms that God has been working in, with, and through all of these human actions, even those that were intended for harm. God's purposes for bringing life to this family were being fulfilled. So Joseph's story asks us to consider, how do we know what the events of our lives mean? As we reflect back on important events or milestones in our lives, we wonder about the meaning and purpose in them. In the joys and challenges that life brings, we wonder where or whether the hand of God has been at work. We wonder about how the events in our lives are related to God's will. Are they? Were they? It is worth pondering how or if our faith gives to our lives a different sense of meaning and purpose. Some people find meaning or even divine purpose and guidance in almost any life event. It is a belief that God is actively at work in all that happens to me. God is directing what happens. The gift of this perspective is that God is perceived to be near and active in the way life is unfolding for me. When good things happen, God is to be praised. When bad things happen, God is to be trusted to use it for some kind of purpose. The challenge of this perspective is that God then becomes the author of some pretty terrible things that do not seem to be working for good. It can also be an excuse for us from taking responsibility for our actions because all things are God's will. On the other hand, other people believe that God is somewhat absent from the minutiae of human life, and maybe even from the larger events in human history. The gift of this perspective is that humans must take responsibility for their agency, for their triumphs and their failures. It is a belief that God has given us instructions and pointed us in the right direction, and now it's up to us. God only has our hands. The challenge of this perspective is that God becomes distant and cold, watching humans flailing around, doing what they will in isolation from divine mercy or guidance. Many of us, as people of faith, I would describe ourselves dwelling in the mystery between these two different perspectives. We live in the tension between God's nearness and God's distance or hiddenness. We live in the tension between God's action and God's inaction. We struggle with understanding whether God causes things to happen. Is God pulling the strings of our lives? We live in the mystery of how our life choices and actions can be used for God's purposes. And we wonder at the mystery of God's presence in life events, yet nevertheless experience redemption and forgiveness and meaning through our faith. God's presence with us is a mystery, and yet it gives meaning, even if we cannot understand or explain how it works. So we are left to live in the mystery of God's presence and activity in the unfolding of our lives. I think that the thing that the Joseph story allows us to affirm is that it's precisely in the arena of human choices and actions where God's saving work happens. God is free to work for redemption in spite of, and through, and even against human effort. God God works through human actions, even using actions meant for evil. God's ways are at work regardless of human attitudes or actions, yet at the same time, God honors the work of his creatures. Joseph and his brothers were free to do their work, but in the end, God was at work in their work and brought life to this broken family. As theologian Walter Brueggemann writes, neither the freedom of the creature nor the gracious sovereignty of God is canceled. They are not in conflict, nor are they to be equated. God's will makes use of all human action, but is not domesticated or limited by any human choice. God's purpose is finally sovereign and is utterly gracious and life-giving, offering hope for restoration. At the end of the Joseph story, that is what we find. A shattered family is restored. They find reconciliation and redemption through the graciousness of God's presence throughout their life journey. The whole family is brought to live in Egypt in the land of Goshen to be saved from the famine and saved for God's purposes for the future. In just the same way, God continues to work in our lives. God's presence, whether obvious or hidden, works for our redemption. God seeks us when we are lost and found, doubtful and faithful, bound and free, wronged and forgiving. God's presence with us is a mystery, and it is life-giving and provides meaning. May it be so. The blessing of God, the shalom of God, the warmth of God be among us and between us now and always. Go in peace.